Greetings, greetings. Welcome to another edition of Revolutionary Hoodoo, New Orleans Voodoo Secrets and Recipes. All is truly and indeed a blessing. Come on in, come on in. The fire is hot. The water is a-boiling. Come on in. All is truly and indeed a blessing. Welcome, welcome. All is a blessing, yes. My phone lines, area code 845-277-9143. 845-277-9143. Press the number 1 on your telephone keypad. I'll be more than happy to bring you into the conversation. Come on in. All is a blessing. Welcome. Greetings and salutations. Welcome, welcome. Humbled and honored, yes. All is a blessing. She's calling your name to win. Come back home to Africa. The fatty calf and golden rings are waiting for you once again. Coming back to you. Come on in, y'all. Yes, welcome this Monday, October 5th. Come on in. We're broadcasting live on Facebook, Twitter, Periscope, Earthcam, YouTube, StreamYard. Come on in. Blog Talk Radio. Come on in. Greetings, greetings, and salutations. Yes. Thank you kindly. Yes. We got a lot to talk about today. There's a lot going on in the world. We got new history, new voodoo secrets and recipes. I invite you to join me here now live on air by way of the StreamYard link. You can also call in at 845-277-9143. If your webcam situation ain't together, you can call in at area code toll free 845-277-9143. Welcome, welcome. All is a blessing. Greetings. Greetings and salutations, beloved. Greetings, Sandra C. Welcome, beloved. Greetings. T2 Davy. Greetings, beloved. Welcome, welcome, Shamafia. Welcome, beloved. All is a blessing, yes. Alafia, Alafia. Welcome, welcome. Kabaragani, come on in. Babwani, come on in. Welcome, welcome. In whatever language, in whatever dialogue. Come on in, come on in. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Aquaba. Aquaba. Jumbo. Kedu. Peleo. Peleo. Eshu Alekwana Kosi Weri. Awo Onlo Uto Ne Iwo Ada Afanbo Osi. Obatala Ni Ita Ni Ebo Onilio Aban Eshu. Eshu is the respected elder who flogs, confronts, uncovers fools. That one versed in mysteries uses truth to own you. He causes scatter to feed poverty. Obatala shapes rascals to have sacrifice. The owner of warnings is the one who is Eshu, Aboru, Aboye, Aboshishe, Ashe. May our Ebo reach your room. May our Ebo be accepted. May our Ebo allow what we desire to come to pass. And so we say, Ashe, Asheo, Ashe. Divine, all blessed greetings and salutations this Monday, October 5th. You are now listening live to the Divine Prince, Pan-African Spiritualist, practitioner, author, and advisor, Elagun Oloye Hutu Obeya Bokur, sharing with you in all things spiritual, mystical, metaphysical, cosmic, evolutionary, revolutionary, healing, and holistic dibia from a Pan-African Hoodoo world spiritualist perspective, understanding that all is truly and indeed a blessing. You can just see beyond the veils, for it is all just an illusion and a test in one of the greatest divine mysteries of this life cycle. This is my constant prayer, my mantra, affirmation, reverberation, reiteration, and it is my personal living reality. It is indeed crucial to every endeavor that I seek, every journey that I embark on, the beginning, the ending, the place where I realize and crystallize all my endeavors, understanding that I and I alone create and co-create my divine destiny, and I alone create and co-create my divine blessed reality. And so it is. Ashe. I am always humbled and appreciative to have the opportunity to meet you here in this created sacred space of gods and goddesses among our ancestors, our collective and individual ancestors, if you will. I am eternally grateful for Congo Square and Congo Square Preservation Society and for the community and being a part, being connected to, again, something that is indeed sacred. And it's not just sacred and spiritual and mystical and religious for some of us, political for others, but indeed it is our first line of defense. Our first line of defense in any endeavor that we might embark on, any challenge that we might be confronted with, any opportunity that we might have to move light forward and to move that which is within our best interest forward, to move God forward. For indeed, when we're resonating in the appropriate frequency, we indeed resonate with ourselves, but we also co-resonate with the divine creators. And it gives us greater energy, greater access to that which allows us to create and recreate our reality. And many of you have heard me say that there is no voodoo without nature. There is no Ifa, there is no Akan, there is no Santeria or Lukumi or Palo without nature. No Maria Leonza, no 21 divisions, no Haitian voodoo that is absent of nature. Nature. And so spirit is not just this sort of smoky, ethereal, misty form that we co-create within, which indeed that is a relative reality. But it's also very real, very physical, very tangible spirit that we operate in, that exists in nature. Some call it animistic, the idea that we understand that all things possess spirit, but particularly nature, particularly your plants, your herbs, your woods, the ground, the very soil in which life is born and reborn in. Our marshy, swampy areas, our moist areas on the planet that create and recreate not just fruit and produce and vegetables and foliage, but indeed infirmities and disease and viruses and things that we traditionally wouldn't make contact with. Traditionally, nature has its way of handling its own. Nature has its way of handling itself. And so our jungles and our dense areas have housed, some would say for thousands of years, viruses and contaminants that we normally in humanity would not have connection to. But as we continue to destroy nature and cut down the trees and herbicide our yards and eliminate what's healthy, what's fruitful, what's edible, what's medicine, and begin to rely more and more on just science and technology, which has to include marketing, commerce, capitalism. Some of those words don't ring positive with my spirit. Some of those words don't ring positive with your spirit, while other words might be a necessity to our very survival. So it's hard sometimes. Me and my mom had this discussion over the weekend. It's hard sometimes for me to separate spirit and spirituality and religion from politics, in particular voodoo with four O's, particularly voodoo with a U, particularly because it was in this environment of politics, of forced servitude, enslavement, of wicked leaders and wicked rulers and capitalists who would otherwise disregard your humanity, disregard your very life for their own benefit, for their own self endowment. So sometimes it's very hard. Greetings, Matthew Ferguson. Divine all blessed, peace and blessings. Sometimes it's hard to separate politics from spirit in our daily lives. Our daily lives are fumigated with so much pollution. Even amongst the wonders of technology, so much pollution. We can use our internet to search information and research and history and study, but then at the same time, we're getting a great degree of pollution, negativity and jealousy and harm and violence and wickedness that exists in the world. It's easy to unplug the TV. It's easy sometimes to tune out. But at some point, you have to be in touch with the very world that we have to wake up in every day, that our children have to wake up in every day. So it's hard to ignore the shenanigans of the White House. It's hard to ignore the shenanigans of that Cheeto that y'all call the president. It's very hard to ignore the many depths of messages and code words and signaling that spews out, not just from what he says, but even now from what he does. And so we don't believe a lot of what's being presented to us. We can. And in many cases, we aren't being presented much. If you've been paying attention to what his medical team has been presented to us. So it is indeed in these times that I fall back on ancestors. People say, well, what do you do? How do you deal with it? How do you process it? Along with everyday life. First, I fall back on my ancestors. First, I fall back to my ancestors. That is indeed your front line of defense. I don't care who you are, where you are, what your scenario is, what your income is, what your particular, position in the crossroads of life is. We all have ancestors. We all have those who survived and then ultimately went on to the next level of existence, but survived in this what we call humanity, in this world. And particularly our ancestors that made the Middle Passage, that have survived continuous attempts to stop us, block us, eliminate us, prevent us, denigrate us, dehumanize us, and still I rise. Thank you, Maya Angelou. And still we rise, and still we get up every day. And as one of my godmothers, may she rest in her room, Mama Yeye, used to say, baby, y'all just getting by on your ancestors. Y'all just getting by on your ancestors. Iba I Shango. Iba I Oya. Okay? Ose Shango. But we just getting by on our ancestors in most cases. And when we consider the block, the issue, the complication. Often our ancestors are present in that. They're present in that to move us away from, to deter us from, to distract us from, to draw our attention to that which is in our best interest. And particularly when we can't hear, particularly when we can't see, particularly when we don't understand. Heaven forbid we be in denial or just arrogantly and woefully ignorant. Heaven forbid. But it is indeed the ancestors. I used to hear a saying once upon a time, God protects babies and fools. Did your mama used to say that? Did your grandmama used to say that? God protect babies and fools. You know, so there's a degree in there, in the middle, where we're obligated to be co-creators. It's more than just our immediate need. Though our immediate needs are important, our immediate needs are necessary to our survival and to our overall sense of wellness and well-being and energy and motivation, indeed. But then when do we grow up? When do we step into? And now more than ever, I was in the spirit realm last night, and I kept being led back to 1962. 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Spirit kept saying, never more have we been in danger than we are right now. The most recent past, and the Spirit kept leading me back to 1962. And so I had to do some research, and that was the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I know that predates many of you in this audience. But it was the closest time that we've been to real nuclear war, to really having the communists and Americans launch some kind of toxic, nightmare into the world with the threat of us all being eliminated. And so the time that we exist in right now is more grave than ever before. And so I asked, why can't we see? Why can't we hear? Why don't we understand? Witchcraft. Witchcraft. What explains the madness that we're seeing right now beyond witchcraft, beyond alien intervention, beyond something demonic? And what clouds the vision and clouds the ears of those around him that would subject themselves to potentially death? COVID-19 ain't no joke, people. Do we still need a lesson in COVID-19? COVID-19 is no joke. And so if our president, if the Cheeto in the White House, says one thing and does another, it really puts into dispute what's true and what's truthful. And where does truth and truthfulness get you in the world of 2021, 2020 and 2021, going into 2021? Because this year is about over, y'all. This year is about done. We need to now be focusing on the next thing. So I'm going to get off my political soapbox. Please just vote. Inspire others to vote. Motivate others to vote. Assist your mama, your grandmama, your uncle, your aunt, your cousin, your brother, sister. Assist them in the process. If you can prevent people from having to, go out in public transportation or be exposed to the COVID, do your role. Play your role, but we can't just be inactive. We can't say we all get it, we all understand, we're operating in consciousness, and then not have that show up in demonstration, have that show up in our behavior. there's a moment in time where we must do something. And that moment is right now. The threat is women's rights, the threat is civil rights, the threat is human rights. There are many threats attached to not doing anything right now. And so I just ask you to do something, participate, be active. If you can't get up off the couch, if you can't leave your house, if you can't leave your neighborhood, you know, utilize your internet, utilize your social media, use your Twitter, use your Facebook, your Instagram. I'm seeing people well into their 70s and their 80s that are really active right now in social media like never before, just under the threat of what may happen after this presidential election. And even at my age, I can't remember another presidential election that was this fiery. You know, I remember all the drama around Reagan and the 666. Reagan's first name, middle name, last name had 6 letters in it. And he was the mark of the beast. And, you know, people were really, really worked up. And if I'm not mistaken, that number fell for the three-digit lotto number in Washington, D.C. Okay, during that time period. And so it was a big deal. It was a big deal. But now it makes Reagan, it makes Bush, it makes Obama, it makes Carter, it makes many who come before him pale in comparison, weak in comparison to the danger that we might be in right now if this man is continuing to lead, is continuing to do what he's doing. So I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna invite you to be a part of the conversation today. We're going to talk a little bit about plants and herbs, what the Yoruba call ewe, where the spirit of voodoo exists in the plants. And I want to draw from African American slave medicine from the 19th century. There were many different factors that led to the effectiveness of African American slave medicine during the early mid-19th century United States, or what we now come to understand as the antebellum period. African slaves who were taken away from their native lands carried with them their own native medical practices and knowledge. Their pre-established medical knowledge would grow over time as countless generations of African Americans would soon be exposed to the medical cultures of both the Native Americans and the white European immigrants. The function slave practice medicine would play in the society during this time period would also be shaped by the new complex social conditions of slavery. The value each slave owner as well as community placed on slave practice medicine was different from one plantation to the next. This provided a number of different environments where medicine practiced by the enslaved was both nurtured and suppressed, compared to the kind of westernized medicine that was being conducted by white medical practitioners at this time, especially in the South. Slave practice medicine was in some ways advanced for its time, considering that most all slaves in the United States could not read or write during this time. Slaves who did practice medicine were largely unaware of the actual science behind what they were doing. This reason alone is most likely responsible for why medicine practiced by African American enslaved was looked down upon by many white owners and doctors of the antebellum period. However, with the luxuries of today's knowledge of modern chemical science, we are able to see just how advanced some of these herbal cures really were in both their biological complexity and their ability to cure specific ailments. The widespread usage of medical herbs and holistic natural plant-based remedies by the enslaved of the early to mid-19th century were equally as effective in treating ailments of the body when compared to commonly practiced white medicine of the same time era. And in some cases, medicine practiced by slaves was more effective in treating the physical and psychological conditions of the patients than the medicine practiced by their white counterparts. This shows that African American enslaved provided a significant contribution to the medical community of the United States. There were a plethora of different herbs, roots, bark, spices, and other naturally occurring biological components used in slave medicine. Their uses as well as prevalence were contingent on their availability and usefulness. Some of these cures worked well. Some offered little more than coincidental cures, and others were even a bane to a person's health. However, each of these cures, effective or not, built upon the already pre-established knowledge that slaves had of medicine. Their experimentation with various kinds of plant-based remedies is what led them to make these great, albeit unknown, breakthroughs in medicine that we still really use today. One particular herbal cure used by African American slaves was a plant called Asafoetida. Asafoetida. Asafoetida is a perennial closely related to Silphium of Cyrene. It has characteristics of plants in the fennel family. It is native to India and Iran, but was most likely brought over to the New World by European settlers. As its name implies, Asafoetida has a fetid odor to it. Asafoetida is spelled Afetid, like David, A. Asafoetida has a fetid, Fetid, odor to it. It is commonly referred to as stinking gum or devil's dung. Asafoetida is popular in Indian cooking, and it has a similar taste to leeks. The dried sap of the plant, extracted from the stem and the roots, forms a resin-like gum. Commercial usage of the plant mix this resin with rice flour and gum arabic. Victoria Adams of Columbia, South Carolina, recalls using the plant as a preventative measure against diseases on her plantation. She said they would dip asafoetida in turpentine and hung it round our necks to keep off disease. Asafoetida was used as a preventative against a number of pulmonary diseases such as whooping cough, bronchitis, smallpox, and emphysema. It was usually placed in a bag around someone's neck so that they could breathe in the fumes. Asafoetida is found to have worked as an anti-flatulent by reducing the amount of indigestion, by reducing the amount of indigenous microflora in the gut. Because of its close relation with the famed Silphium of Cyrene, belonging to the same family as Ferula, it had also been reported to contain naturally occurring organic contraceptive counterparts. However, its most notable traits are its antimicrobial or antibiotic elements, and its ability to fight off influenza as well as other forms of viral flus. We ingested asafoetida, worked it in the gut to limit bacteria growth, but when worn around the neck, the pungent fumes can open congested airways to kill harmful bacteria in the nasal passages. The U.S. Pharmacopoeia approved of the herb, to fight the spread of Spanish influenza in 1918. In 2009, it was later found out that the roots of the plant produce a natural antiviral drug compound that was effective in fighting strains of flu, like the H1N1 virus in vitro. This may have been an important factor concerning its effectiveness against Spanish influenza. Modern medicine at the time did not have anything of this potency that was able to combat many of the pulmonary diseases suffered by both whites and African Americans. The use of turpentine on these resins most likely acted similar to Vicks Vapor Rub in its ability to open up nasal passageways. Turpentine also acts well as an antiseptic due to its nature as an organic solvent. Turpentine is a sap harvested from a number of different pines in the United States, and it is primarily made up of organic molecules such as pinene, Pinenes. However, turpentine is also extremely flammable, and because of its nature as an organic solvent, it is often harmful to breathe directly into the lungs. When turpentine is applied to the skin, it also irritates the applied site and can cause bad rashes. Other forms of medicine employ the use of boiled water to dissolve polar organic materials in teas for oral consumption. And some of you might remember a little while back, I shared a bit of a recipe that I learned from my mother, particularly during cold and flu season. And I'm not sure if she gained the knowledge from her mother, but the use of pine cones, and particularly the brown, hard, woody pine cones, not the green pine cones. That could kill you. But the hard, woody pine cones that you find, particularly up north. Clean them really well. Wash them, and the boiled compounds that I just shared with you are what's produced when you boil that pine cone. And that tea is drinkable. You can add honey to it, another natural organic antibiotic. You can add garlic to it, onion to it, and believe it or not, it doesn't taste quite as bad as it might sound like it would. Particularly if you add a little honey to it, to give it a little extra flavor. But it's very powerful for opening up the passageways, the airway. And I don't want to confuse this as some kind of reference to what we're dealing with right now. I'm just sharing some history. I'm not suggesting that this has anything to do, and I don't want to say it because if I say it out loud, the show gets flagged. But you all know what we're dealing with right now. Between February and right. So I'm not speaking to that, but I'm speaking to ways in which even before we had access to the healthcare system, even before we had access to some Obamacare, even before we had access to any sort of professional medical intervention, we indeed had to heal ourselves, had to rely on the knowledge, the wisdom, the understanding that we had and possessed and managed to hold on to even through the Middle Passage, even through attempts to eliminate and eradicate any memory of our own knowledge. And so it's very powerful to have that awareness going into 2021 as we become spiritualists, as we realize the opportunity to grow ministry, as we realize the opportunity to grow health and wellness in 2021 in a way that's never been present before. and particularly for our communities. The desire to become herbalists and spiritualists and healers and healers and other forms of spiritual and religious practitioners is a very noble challenge. And indeed, it's a vocation. And so we should provide our best, learn what we can, grow where we can, gain all the experience that we can, absorb the knowledge of our elders while it's available to us, and not just in books, not just in digital form, but indeed absorb the knowledge, the words, the energy, the wisdom of our living elders while they are yet among us, so that we don't lose connection ever to this information. I'm also greatly concerned about the elimination of what's natural, and particularly in the cities and suburbs, where people are applying herbicides and all sorts of chemicals to eliminate your clovers and your dandelions and your other edible and herbal growth that's coming up, in your otherwise healthy yard. That's one of the reasons it's coming up in your otherwise healthy yard, is because the soil in the ground is fertile for the growth of food and healing plants. I have a preference for that which is edible and usable. I don't particularly care a lot about what's ornamental. For indeed, edible and herbal plants can be ornamental, can be extremely ornamental. There's nothing better than a healthy rosemary bush. There's nothing, more appealing than basil and a variety of basils that are available to us that offer fragrance and offer ornamentation and draw healthy bees and butterflies, to your yard, to your garden, to your produce, that help to preserve life on the planet. Such examples of these practices are the usages of salve had for, let me go back. Other forms of medicine imply the use of boiled water to dissolve polar organic materials into teas for oral consumption. And then I stopped and shared the story about boiling the pine cones, for congestion. And such examples of these practices are the use salves had for burdock root. Burdock root is more famously known as Articum lapa, or the plant that inspired George de Mestral of Switzerland to come up with the idea for Velcro in 1941, after observing the way the seeds of the plant hooked onto clothing. The root of the plant was sometimes ingested directly, and other times was ground up using tea as a means of administering the drug. Modern science has found that the root of the plant possesses antibacterial or antibiotic and antifungal properties. There is also evidence that burdock root contains compounds that demonstrate anti-inflammatory properties. On top of this, burdock root is a diuretic and can be used in the treatment of diabetes. Herbalists use the root for the treatment of dropsy, gout, blood purification, rheumatism, and fungal infections. It's also referred to mountain rose herbs. This root was crucial in the production of gentle antibiotic salves and pills. The medical knowledge that slaves, they got salves in one sentence and slaves in the other, and my dyslexia is like, what's going on? Okay, the medical knowledge that slaves contributed to Western medicine is not just limited to what they learned while in the United States. Some medical procedures that existed in Africa before enslavement were introduced to whites in the U.S. after the enslaved were taken from the continent. The most famous case is the one of native-born West African and then slave Wansimius, Onesimus. Once Ones, come on, y'all. Onesimus. Help me with this word. I'm gonna pop it in the chat. If somebody wants to join me online, please, I welcome you to join me here on screen. I also invite you to call me at 845-277-9143. Greetings, everyone I haven't acknowledged individually and collectively. Star Bright Child, Craig Burns, Matthew Ferguson, Enzo Khalifa, Sir Naturalista, Light Bearer. Welcome, welcome. Chef Bougie, greetings, beloved. Is Orisha here? Iba, Orisha, welcome, welcome. I did pop that word in. If somebody, wants to help me out with the greetings, Frida Nunn, with the pronunciations, I'd appreciate that. Yeah, I have 5 different types of basil in my yard. They have similar characteristics. The way they flower at the top, the way they grow that long, stem at the top where the seed pods are, but they're different flavors, different colors. The leaf shapes are slightly different. Yes, chamomile is a common herb, easy to find. Many of you are mowing down or poisoning chamomile in your yard, and you may not even realize it. And then we turn around and go to the herb store or GNC and spend good money to buy what we're poisoning, in these lush green yards and pulling up in the urban areas. Yes, greetings, greetings. Thank you for that, Chef Bougie. Sandra C, yes. Yes, burdock, yarrow, plantain, nettle, chamomile, dandelion, wild mint. These are all commonly found almost all over America, and particularly at abandoned properties, abandoned houses, areas that are least likeliest to be contaminated with your herbicides and your lawn chemicals and human activity. It's in those areas that you're most likeliest to find these plants growing. Otherwise, where they're being cultivated, or in places where they're not being cultivated, are these unmonitored areas. Greetings, 314. I see you on the phone line. Press the number 1 if you have a comment, question. Thank you. So how you pronounce that? Onesimus, who brought the knowledge of smallpox inoculation to the U.S. from Africa. It was Onesimus who stated to his master, the well-known theologian from Massachusetts, Cotton Mather, that he had the procedure performed on him in Africa. With the knowledge of Onesimus gave him just before his death in 1717, Cotton Mather was able to curb a smallpox outbreak in Boston in 1721. However, the practice of inoculation in America at the time was still widely criticized. This kind of medical knowledge wouldn't become known in mainstream medicine until Edward Jenner popularized the idea through his innovation of vaccines in 1796. 1796. Now, I also want to stop and take note that this process of inoculation for smallpox came by way of priests of Oba Luoye, Baba Luoye, Sakpata, Sanpata, who we know in Ifa, Yoruba, Voodoo, Lukumi, Santeria, as a deity, a Loa, if you will, of infirmities and disease. And you hear me often say here that he is not the creator of, but indeed the solution, the antidote, the healing for it. And it was by way of accessing this particular practice and this particular set of traditions that our beloved ancestor was able to have his knowledge appropriated, and we now have the inoculations that we have today against smallpox, and at a greater degree. Let me check my phone line. Area code 601. Greetings and salutations, beloved. Who's calling? Is that my mom?
Hi, son. How are you today?
All is a blessing, in yourself.
I'm doing very well. This is a very interesting show. You brought back a lot of memories. Your great-great-grandmother on your dad's side. I took you home to Mississippi when you were about 5 months old and you had a bad cold. And she rubbed you with some kind of stinky goo. She said, and I said, oh, that stuff smells so bad. She said, I don't want that on my baby. She said, girl, give me that baby. And she put you on that bed and rubbed you all over with that stuff, but it got rid of that cough and that, all that inflammation you had in your chest. And your grandmother used to cook salad off of the things were along the back fence of my mother. And also, there was a lady in our neighborhood that used to go up by the railroad tracks and pick dandelions and sell the greens every year. And your grandmother used to cook those. And your great-great-grandmother, my grandmother, used to use turpentine for certain ailments. And your paternal grandfather, your great-great-paternal grandfather, my grandfather, used to use something called Asafoetida. It was some kind of sticky stuff. It looked like chewing tobacco. You put the water and stuff in the bottle and shake it up and take it every so often. But it was some stinking stuff. But all of those old home remedies are good. Now we run to the doctor for everything, and we have most of that stuff growing in our yard.
Yes.
And I'm going to stop this line and go back to the TV because there's two different things going on here, and I get confused.
Right. I understand. Thanks for calling in. All is a blessing. Certainly appreciate the information and the history and the confirmation. Asafoetida, I believe, is the name of that herb. Is one of the things I had just talked about in the material that was utilized by the enslaved Africans to perform healing and other concoctions and potions and notions that aren't readily documented. We know that they had healing properties, but we also know that in the right mixtures and the right doses, these things could also be poison. And it furthers the notion that African-based spiritual practices, hoodoo, voodoo, obia, etc., would have been forced underground to some degree, just out of the sheer fear surrounding our knowledge and our ability to utilize that knowledge, not just for healing, not just for good, but also for revolution. The biggest fear, I believe, that they ever had for us, around us, with us, was that of revolution, that of uprising, that of us just refusing to go along with the system anymore, refusing to participate, refusing to be subjugated to. And in many ways, that which is distracting my mother on television right now, in many ways, we have to refuse to go along right now. We have to refuse to just accept the status quo. We have to refuse to just accept things as they've always been. And we've got to make really conscious, concerted efforts to change our present, but also our future and that of America, that environment in which we're all going to have to continue to live and survive into the next generation. Having some great utopia somewhere, some island to go to somewhere would be great. But it's just not a reality for us right now, at least not physically, but consciously, spiritually, energetically, emotionally. We can repatriate, if you will. We can go back to, if you will. We can return to and then rebring this knowledge, this information into our present, and then seed it again into the next generation, into the future. As stated before, the means by which African American slaves generated this knowledge was through a complicated series of relationships with people of various other races and ethnicities. These were a series of relationships that spanned generations all across the country. It is crucial to remember that for the most part, slaves in the United States could not read or write. In a number of the Library of Congress slave narratives born in slavery, many former slaves recollect that their former masters were wholly against the idea of having their slaves learn how to read or to write. Many states passed laws that forbade people from teaching slaves how to read or write. So information regarding various skills and trades was passed down via word of mouth from generation to generation. All of this was done in order to preserve knowledge that had been so tirelessly paid for in blood and sweat. And it reminds me of the memory that some of my grandparents and older people in my family had, and some still do that are living today, and their ability to remember such fine detail. Um, no idea of Asperger, not Asperger's, but Alzheimer's or Alzheimer's. Sometimes we call it old timers, and dementia and senility. No idea of that. Now, I did have, particularly my dad's family, I can remember Aunt Mary, who was probably my great aunt, having being the first person that I became aware of senility. We weren't even calling it, um, what do you call it, y'all? We weren't calling it, I've called it old timers so much that I can't remember the correct word, um, that affects our senior citizens. Hold on, let me look up that word. Now, see, if y'all were on the phones with me, I wouldn't have to type all these words in. And Alzheimer's, Alzheimer's. I'm used to hearing old timers that sometimes I forget it's Alzheimer's. But that's a new thing in terms of our knowledge of it as a society. I think in terms of knowledge of it, even from the medical perspective. But I think it has a lot to do with how we eat, what we drink, how we live, and the contaminants that we are being exposed to. High up on the list would be plastic. I just don't trust plastic. And if I can avoid buying anything in plastic, particularly water, I do. I think that plastic is leaking more than just what's been, thank you, Frida Nunn, more than just what's being revealed to us. So I don't drink bottled water in plastic. I might use it in pouring a libation out in public. I might use it, pre-COVID-19 on a movie set. But now today, if I had to go out, I would carry my water, in my personal container. I'm just leery of plastic and many other things that exist now in our environments that could be adding to this rise of mental health based conditions like Asperger's and ADHD and Alzheimer's and dementia and all these other health and mental health based conditions that we now see prevalent. And like my mom was just sharing, I remember my grandmother and great grandmother's and fathers just having this extraordinary memories. And so the idea that we would memorize and remember these herbs, these plants, these roots, their usage, encode them into songs. Me and Merlene just talked about that this morning. How some of us learn better through songs, through harmony, through rhythm. The classroom, the traditional classroom setting doesn't work for all of us. And some of us, myself included, had to be exposed to the museum, the zoo, nature, wilderness, the countryside, to stimulate aspects of consciousness that just aren't tapped in the classroom. And many of you are concerned today about virtual learning, a whole nother degree of learning that we now have to learn and adjust to, by way of video, by way of webcam, by way of Zoom, and of course, distance learning. And I think this is another opportunity to expose ourselves and our children to book learning, but also exploring the world through the technology, even virtually, that is available to us, and absorbing knowledge that you just would not normally get in your traditional classroom setting. I think in that environment, I remember having seed pods. We grew seed pods in elementary school. I don't know how common that is today. We had some connection to understanding where our food came from, how our food was grown, how our meat, was produced. I don't know how common that is today, in the educational system. I know we see it in the museums. I know we see it on display, in workshop environments. So this is an opportunity for us to, again, remember so that we can move forward. Someone asked earlier today about focusing on things of the past. Let me read his point, his comment. Greetings, Blog Talk Radio, area code 845-277-9143. 845-277-9143. If you have a question, comment, or request, just press the number 1 on your telephone keypad. I'll be more than happy to unmute your mic. I posted in Twitter, Facebook about Harriet Jacobs, born in 1813. Harriet Jacobs was frequently the victim of brutal sexual assault from her master, James Norcom. Even when Jacobs took on a lover and had 2 children with him, Norcom's sexual advances continued. Finally, it got to be more than she could bear. And in 1835, she went to hide with friends and family in the attic of their plantation house. And she lived in this cramped attic space, I believe, for 7 years before Jacobs made an escape north and gained access to her freedom. She hid in a cramped crawl space in her grandmother's attic on the North Carolina plantation, barely big enough to accommodate her. The space was infested with rats. So nonetheless, she lived there for 7 years, and in 1842, she escaped the plantation by boat to Philadelphia. Upon arriving, she was taken in by the members of the Philadelphia Vigilant Committee. She later wrote about her life and trials in the memoir Incidents. It's called In the Memoir Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And it's about, again, Harriet Jacobs. And so most people responded, respect and love, courageous woman. We love you, mommy. Thank you so much for the history. Measures of survival lives within. And my soul looks back in wonder. This is heavy. Our people are beyond measure. And then my beloved brother comes and says, when you dwell on things we've been subjugated or subject to as a people, ... So he doesn't give an opinion. He doesn't complete his sentence. He doesn't formulate a clear thought so that you understand, what he's really saying. But for me, it's a story, as it is for many who responded to it, of great survival, miraculous survival, beating all odds no matter what, getting up again and moving on and growing on and gaining access to a better destiny, no matter what things might look like in the present moment. And I think even in today's culture, today's society, it's just too easy to become so negative, so dark, to see so much news, to see so much, media, to hear so much negativity that we don't see the hope, we don't see the opportunities for change. Excuse me, that we don't see the opportunities to really make a difference. Sandra, see, that we don't have an opportunity to protect our environment. So I take great pleasure in exploring the past, in exploring these documents, and gaining access to the knowledge of not just, the negatives of our past, but indeed the nuggets of gold that exist within our past. In the case of medical knowledge, slaves would share their learned knowledge, usually with their immediate family on the plantation. And since it was not common for slaves to venture out into other plantations, much of their gained medical knowledge did not permeate far beyond their homes. Anne Whitley Ware of Texas, born in 1857, remembers her mother training her in herbal medicines. Mammy was trained to be a doctor. In them days, they'd get their medicine from the woods and would make their salves, liniments, and such. Mammy learned me what she knew about doctoring. However, wandering root doctors or local herbalists were not uncommon in areas of high concentration of slaves. These people were most likely responsible for what kind of information did make it out of the plantations. The root doctors and the local herbalists that had freedom to move about, or liberty, I should say, to move about, either under the guidance or the watchful eye of the slave owner or master. Sometimes they may have been rented out. Their service may have been rented out, particularly if their particular craft or skill uh, was worthy of earning an income. And so not only were we bought and sold, but our skills were bought, sold, rented out, if you will, under the watchful eye of slave owners. And so successful root doctors and successful local herbalists sometimes were given some liberty to move out into the community and carry that information to other areas, to other plantations, to other communities. African slaves, when coming into the New World, brought with them their various cultural practices and knowledge of medicine. Unfortunately, a majority of what they knew about medicine had to be relearned because most all of their traditional remedies were based on naturally occurring plant resources that were available to them in Africa. So North America was a whole new alien continent with a vastly different ecosystem. This was a similar problem that first challenged many new European settlers coming to the New World as well. For the Europeans, trained physicians were few and far between. In addition to that, supply ships from Europe that carried medical supplies for the settlers, especially during the winter months, were very, very rare. Early settlers turned towards Native Americans for help with treating illness and for trading medicinal herbs. Native Americans contributed a great amount to the American pharmacopoeia, and the knowledge that they first shared with the early European immigrants was still being used by physicians up throughout the 19th century. It was this mix of European and Native American medicine that many Africans first studied. The acquired knowledge from these new medical practices mixed with their own pre-established ones. Many Native Americans even shared their knowledge directly with the enslaved Africans. Both African and Native American medicines were heavily steeped in the idea that magic played an important role in the healing process. In many African cultures, someone was a skilled healer who also was equally skilled in spirit. As Aber C. Covey, you might say Herbert, we say Aber in Louisiana. Herbert C. Covey says, the spiritual aspects of healing and curing, as well as the role of the family, spiritual possession, witchcraft, sorcery, herbs and plants, and beliefs played an important role in traditional West African healing arts. African American slaves learned the medicinal knowledge of whites by direct osmosis. Marie Jenkins Swartz explains this process. Slaves were familiar with the therapies of the physicians. Knowledge of regular medicine among slaves stemmed from their involvement as patients, nurses, midwives, and servants. Even though slaves had learned a considerable amount of their medical knowledge from whites, such as how to diagnose ailments based on symptoms, how to conduct bedside manner, and general preventative care for ailments, there was still a stigma against slaves practicing medicine. Many whites did not trust slaves practicing medicine on the plantation or on them. White people of the time saw the spiritual side of African American medicine as something wholly uncivilized. They looked at people who practiced hoodoo, root work, conjure, and other forms of spiritual healing as quacks. Many plantation owners forbade their slaves from treating themselves or other slaves with herbal remedies. They feared that enslaved people waited too long before applying treatments, were incompetent, ignorant, lazy, and were intolerant when ailments got out of hand. There was also the fear that slaves would poison their masters as revenge for mistreatment. Many plantation owners would beat slaves if they were caught practicing medicine. Some white people, however, saw the benefits in allowing slaves to practice medicine, and even had family members saved by the quick action of their slaves, where modern medicine had failed. There was such a rise in the number of African American herbalists and medical practitioners that the South Carolina General Assembly passed a law in 1749 that prohibited slaves from being employed by physicians to concoct poisons or administer medicine of any kind. However, slave medicine continued. Many slaves saw medicine as one of their few freedoms left, the freedom to treat their own body. Some plantation owners would allow it, some, pla- some plantation owners would allow it if a physician's aid failed to cure someone. Still, other owners had a complete distrust of modern medical physicians altogether, so they opted for their own home remedies. The conditions for what was allowed on a plantation varied from owner to owner. It was usually a slave owner's personal experience with either slave practiced medicine or modern medicine that gave him opinion on the matter. Some slave owners saw slaves caring for each other's health as an opportunity for slaves to fake illness to get out of doing work. Slave owners, developed the attitude that if a slave complained of illness, he was acting like a true Negro in ways poorly to escape work. However, it was often in the best interest of the slave's owner to allow his slaves to care for themselves. Slave owners did not have to pay for or wait for physicians to come and treat their slaves. Other times, having a slave treat another slave eased the mind of the patient, and it led to a better morale among slaves on the plantation. And it's interesting how many of these conditions, how many of these concerns, how many of the things that they were paranoid about, maybe rightfully so, concerned about, maybe rightfully so, still exist today. And not just exist today, are reinforced today by many of the things, such as what's going on right now at the WH, that we see in the media, that we see in the news. And so add that on top of Tuskegee, add that on top of slave history, with medicine and with doctors and with the pharmacological processes of the system. And so we still have sort of that dynamic still exists today. Those who won't go to the hospital, won't go to the doctor to save their life, but might take herbs, might consider potions and concoctions that I might offer them. What made slave practice medicine so important during the 19th century was the state of medical care that existed in the South. Medicine in the South was becoming more and more westernized. Westernized medicine was, during the mid-19th century, a popular emerging field that relied on the heavy usage of powerful drugs and the use of modern surgery to cure both physical and psychological ailments. Formally trained medical practitioners were attempting to move away from the European system of homeopathic cures that had become so popular in the United States after its conception by Samuel Hahnemann in 1796. Let me put that in the chat. Homeopathy was similar to the doctrine of signatures, a much older form of medicine, in the sense that it based itself on the idea that likes cure likes. So, for instance, if you had, inflammation, then they might give you pepper, Tabasco, hot herbs, hot plants, in order to sort of counterbalance that condition. And homeopathy is still popular, by the way, even in 2020, particularly out west and in California. This is not to say that medical practitioners had diverged completely from homeopathic or traditional herbal remedies. Dr. Ewell, a well-known 19th century physician, revealed that the contents of his medical chest contained substances like Peruvian bark, gum arabic, essence of peppermint, a tincture of foxglove, arrowroot. However, most of the new advancements in modern medicine resulted in harsh remedies that were typically some form of laxative, an antagonistic opium derivative, a purging compound, or anti-rheumatoid in nature. Formally trained physicians began using these forms of medicine heavily when treating the symptoms of both African American slaves and whites alike. Bleeding or cupping, purging, puking, and blistering became the standard for most formally trained medical practitioners. Cupping, for some reason, has made a revival in 2020, and I'm still trying to figure that one out. These treatments were so frequently used and prevalent in the southern United States that most issues of antebellum Southern medical journals contained articles written by doctors who routinely purged, puked, and bled their black patients, often to unconsciousness. These practices quite often created a distrust of modern medicine among slaves, who were forcibly subjected to its treatments by the slave owners and whites, who still clung to valued homeopathic home remedies that were usually passed down through families. And these new medicines were expensive and required a higher skill to administer. Plus, formally trained physicians and medical practitioners were common only in highly populated areas of the South. In 1847, a physician by the name of Carter P. Johnson published a report in the Transactions of the American Medical Association on the number of regular and non-diploma holding practitioners of 75 Virginia counties and towns. Around 1/3 of these doctors, 294 of 972, had never received diplomas. Another 30 adhered to the Thompsonian system. So many whites and white slave owners distrusted doctors that many called upon irregular medical practitioners such as Thompsonianism, homeopaths, hydropaths, empirics, and eclectics. Let me pop that in the chat, because that's a bit of a tongue twister there. Thompsonianism, homeopaths. I mean, that's a tongue twister for me. That's a tongue twister, y'all. So forgive me. That's why I popped it in the chat. So this Thompsonianism was a branch of medical treatment that came from homeopathic ideologies. It was invented by Samuel Thompson, a self-taught herbalist and botanist from Alstead, New Hampshire, during the late 18th century. The practices used in treatment were centered on the idea of using heat to heal the body. Hydropaths were people who quite obviously used water exposure as a form of medical treatment. These alternative forms of treatment were less expensive and often were available to people who lived far from the city. Oftentimes, plantation owners would permit an overseer to administer versions of their home remedies or therapies on the slaves. Other times, plantation owners would resort to modern practices of bleeding and purging. Much like their stances on slave practice medicine, slave owners' usage of medical treatments stemmed from what they had success with in the past. Saviet explained this when he says medical practice, especially in rural areas, was a matter of trial and error rather than of application of a set of procedures learned in medical school. And let's remember, we were shadow to them. We were no higher than the goats and the sheep and the cow. In fact, they may have valued the goat and the sheep a little bit more with the veterinarian, as opposed to how, they sort of dealt with us. And we see some of that, on your cow plant, your cow farm, your horse farm, people who might think they can correct the problem as opposed to getting a professional sort of come in and address what might be going on. And slaves were an important investment to plantation owners, yet the overall treatment of slaves' health was abysmal. Their health became important only when a slave became sick or injured. When in need of medical care, slaves entered a strange power dynamic. Their master decided when they did or did not need medical care. They also determined what kind of medical treatment they should receive, such as bleeding, purging, powerful opioids, or harsh home remedies. When treated, slaves assumed the role of a patient in need of care, yet had no rights over the treatment they received as patients. Slaves would sometimes fake illness to avoid work, but this action came at a cost. If slaves were found to be lying, they were severely beaten. If their owners did believe that they were indeed ill, they were often forced to take powerful medicines that in turn nearly killed them. Slave medicine was empirical in its approach, meaning that it was mostly a system of healthcare built over time by observations and experience. However, even though slave medicine did follow an empirical style, slaves were more attuned with what kind of natural remedies worked and in which ways. Like other natural remedies, however, there was an element of superstition that at times outweighed practical means. One major difference between African American slave medicine and white medicine was the basis for slave practice medicine was not steeped in the idea that such race was biologically different. This distinction between races may have existed in their outlook on spiritual healing, but not in their decisions when administering herbal medicines. Much of what made modern medicine so brutal towards African Americans was that it was based many times on race. It was based many of its treatments on the idea that Negroes were biologically inferior to whites, whereas slave medicine was medicine. And so they didn't care if it was master or slave, the application of spirit would have been the same. But in modern medicine, race played a role and continues till this day to play a role, as we see it in the COVID-19 numbers and the prevalence of COVID in the Black and brown communities. This idea was argued after physicians in the southern United States observed that many Native Africans possessed an inherent immunity to malaria. Many Native Africans possessed an inherent immunity to malaria, as well as an increased vulnerability to pulmonary diseases such as tuberculosis or whooping cough. From this and other various differences in health, it was accepted by both Southern and Northern medical communities that Africans were biologically inferior to whites, and their race was designed for hard labor. Salvit explains that medical theory and practice were still in such a state of flux in the late 18th and early 19th centuries that there was little risk of any true scientific challenge to medical system based on racial differences. Slave folk practitioners existed primarily as midwives, grannies, herb doctors, root doctors, spiritual healers, kitchen physics, conjure doctors, and to a lesser degree, formally trained physicians. However, those who became formally trained physicians were also freed African Americans. It was also in some ways similar to Eurocentric medicine at that time, considering that it was heretic in many ways. Heretic medicine was a traditional form of medicine that encouraged the use of treatments that were physical or immediately observable. This, of course, often jeopardized many patients' health. Let me pop that in the chat. And I appreciate you all for being here with me, and particularly on this topic. I hope you are hearing and understanding the interconnectedness between slave medicine, herbal practices, American ideas about race and medicine, and how that is still absolutely relevant to today. Heretic medicine. My pronunciation might not always be on point. And so that's why I periodically stop and pop it into the chat so that you all can get the spelling and clarify the pronunciation sometimes of these words for yourselves. There were African Americans, both enslaved and free, who subscribed to modern medicine during the antebellum period. However, when slaves practiced medical treatment such as voiding, bleeding, cupping, etc., it was usually at the command of the master. Most slaves, because of their traditions and aversion to these harsh treatments, sought medical care through herbal treatments, as well as spiritual healing or guidance. Slaves' abilities to treat people with herbal remedies were wholly supported by their knowledge of the environment. Those who were experienced in treating people were also knowledgeable about what was available to them in the surrounding environment. For the most part, health care on a plantation was most often a woman's endeavor. Grannies, or older African American women, were usually the most experienced in the realm of medicine. African American women were also called upon as midwives, wet nurses, bedside nurses, and cooks. This gave them valuable exposure to medical knowledge. Most were often too old to work on the plantations. They took on the primary role of caregiver for infants, children, and the elderly. The time away from working gave them time to forage for roots and other medical biological materials. I also think it's important to note the power that the grannies and the nannies and the Aunt Jemimas and the mammies would have had. The kitchen would have been their space, for sure. Oh, it's in Master's house, and Master paid for the stove, and etc. But it indeed would have been their kitchen, and indeed would have been their space. Indeed, they would have known the order of the spices in the cabinet, what was available in the pantry, and where it was, not just how to use it. And so there's a great deal of power that still exists among our Black women and our Black mothers and grandmothers today within the community. The idea that we are less aware, or we don't acknowledge or show respect anymore is a product of westernization. It is a product of an extension and a symptom of westernization and our exposure and conditioning in the present world culture. our lack of sympathy and empathy and connection to our youngest, our infants and our children, but also to our elderly. The conditions that surrounded slave practice medicine were not only varied, but complex in nature. There is still much left unsaid about the capabilities of slave practice medicine. Equally so, there is much left unsaid about its shortcomings and limitations. Like most medicine in the antebellum South, it was an imperfect art. Neither whites nor blacks could take credit for being completely superior to one another in medical knowledge. However, when we stop to look at the circumstances of each party, we see that the world during this time was not equally optimistic for African Americans. For a group of people to be denied basic human rights, to be denied the access to education, and still be effective in the area of medical treatment as those who were given the right is simply remarkable. The state of modern medicine in the southern United States was not ideal. African American medicine provided beneficial contributions to the field of medicine that had not yet been conceived. For the most part, however, like with most aspects of African American life that had to do with education, African American slave medicine was suppressed. It was suppressed until it became beneficial for plantation owners to use. Asafoetida, that my mom called in and mentioned, burdock root, smallpox, and inoculations were just a few of the many medical advancements made by African American enslaved. There are still others that were more effective and advanced for their time, and for the most part, modern science combined with narratives of the past have been able to weed out which ones were ineffective in their usage. Much of this information not only signifies the importance of African Americans' contribution to the American pharmacopoeia, but it also signifies the importance of African Americans' role in the advancement of westernized medicine. And I'm going to share in the chat the documents and the books for my more advanced students that were drawn from, so that you can do your own further investigation, if you will. I think it's also important to note the shadow of hoodoo, root work, conjure, always has and still sort of haunts the modern medical footprint and demonstration, even till this day. And again, as I said before, many of the fears of industrial medicine, commercialized medicine, the organized medical system as we know it, still exists till this day. Still hard to get some of you to go to a doctor till this day. Still hard to get some of you to go to a dentist. Even today, it's still hard to get some of you to trust, medication, whether it be mental health, whether it be other, physical ailments, even till this day. And so that shadow work just behind modern medicine, just behind modern concepts of wellness, health, wellness, and well-being, still sort of haunt us, ghost us, even today. And so we see vegan, vegetarianism, herbal usage, and herbal usage at a heightened rate, particularly today, that we didn't see necessarily in the 70s. Now, I remember in the 70s and 60s, we had gardens. Grandma had a garden, great-grandmama had a garden, almost everyone had a garden. Neighbors had a garden, front yard, backyard, wherever they had a space, they had a garden. And it kind of fell out of popularity or fell out of usage in the 80s, in the 1980s, in the materialistic 1980s, when we gained much more interest in material things with a label, keeping up with the Joneses, that sort of thing. And so now we're seeing a revival of gardening. We're seeing a revival of baking bread at home, of cooking. We're seeing a revival of hunting and fishing and people learning and relearning to source food for themselves, whether it be for entertainment, for exercise, for sport. But I think many of us are now finding it to be a more important component to our identity, our lineage, and our heritage, and who we are as a people, who we are as individuals. Listen, this has been a great show. I invite your participation. I'm going to give it about maybe 20 more minutes. If you have a question, comment, or request, you can call me on my phone lines at area code 845-277-9143. You are also welcome to follow the link, the StreamYard link, and join us here live on screen with your question, comment, request, memory, experience as it relates to the show topic. Voodoo is nature. Ifa, Akan, Santeria, Lokomi is based and built upon nature. There are no indigenous world traditions that don't involve plant life, herb life, water, what's hot in nature, what's cooling in nature, what soothes and calms in nature. And it was not lost or stripped from us, even by way of the Middle Passage. You all are awfully quiet out there. Is there some kind of technical issue happening with the show? I'm going to take a quick intermission. Then I will be forward momentarily. All is a blessing.
Mouchoir dans tête, roule baguette, fais moun tourner bête, mettez à coup de fouette, côté m'passé, c'est pas poussé, tu fais clever, j'ai ouais bouche bée, si moun pas parler, qui a sauté, plein de faire ma beau, danser pétro, danser yibo, danser kango, m'batte la moirie, oui, couillon m'ke yo sauté, sodom bralé, m'pa prêter, sonner à son pour n'aller, li me baleine pour l'aller, gros journée n'a volé, sur yon li me tifé, nous fait au brigade.
For Iba Voodoo pour yo well. Si yo ka fou ça c'est même commandel. Lève vers matin sous gaba fin pilel. Du côté passé mais toujours quitter well. For Iba Voodoo pour yo well. Si yo ka fou ça c'est même commandel. Lève vers matin sous gaba fin pilel. Du côté passé mais toujours quitter
Yo fait péché ou commis. Pour te yo aime papi. Dans cimetière pour paquet zombie. C'est moi pour lever chaque nuit. Les lois monter dans tête moi brûler Hesili. Aboudaï, bila. Non péristique même pour paquet bâti. Paquet bâti. Sous attaquer c'est ou cap tomber. Si m'pa ka manger on tapito des dieux. Si ou devient pour nous son mal pendier. Si m'pa éliminer on n'aime pas touiller. M'ko tout recette pour me détruire mal fait. Dans tout sec louga ou bon respect. De respecter. M'ka faut un travail diri l'espère.
Moi faut y ba Voodoo pour yo well. Si yo ka fou ça c'est moi commander. Bébé matin sous gaba fin pilel. Côté passé moi toujours quitter well. Moi faut y ba Voodoo pour yo well. Si yo ka fou ça c'est moi commander. Bébé matin sous gaba fin pilel. Côté passé moi toujours quitter well.
Okay, greetings. I'm back. All is truly and indeed a blessing on this episode of Revolutionary Voodoo, New Orleans Voodoo Secrets and Recipes. I was trying to ask in the chat, does Trump have y'all worked up? Y'all are awfully quiet today and a bit distracted. My mama's a little distracted and some of you are too. And so I can imagine, I had to stop and check my Twitter for a moment, that some of you are really worked up by this guy and what's going on. And as I started the show, let's change the narrative. Let's do something different. Let's take action. Let's not just sit back and complain. Let's not just sit back and be quiet. Let's not just sit back and watch this train wreck happen. Make sure you vote. By any means necessary, make sure you vote. By any means necessary, make sure you get your friends, your family, your community to vote. The popular vote ain't good enough this time. Remember that was the Hillary Clinton debacle. Popular vote ain't good enough this time. Remember the Bush and then the Florida count? Popular vote ain't good enough. It must be overwhelming. It must be overwhelming. People have got to get out and vote and be active like never before. We cannot let the distractions, because that's what they are, is distraction. Distract you from the election, distract you from the fact that we've been protesting since March, since April, about police brutality, distraction from COVID-19 and the train wreck of a condition that is in America with over 200,000 dead and still dying. They're predicting a great many more to die of COVID-19 between now and December. So let's not be distracted. I know it might be entertaining, it might be irritating, it might, be an emotional trigger for many of you, and you might need to turn it off. You might need to not take in so much, but by all means, vote. Vote. Melody Young, listen, I see you, I hear you, and this is my personal opinion, so don't get in your feelings, but that's a wasted vote. It's a wasted vote. A third-party vote is a vote for Donald Trump. A third-party vote is a vote for Donald Trump. No third-party candidate is going to win the presidency. It's not happening. It's not happening. I don't even know who the third-party candidates are. I ain't seen no media. I haven't heard any names. I haven't seen any third-party, ads. Bernie Sanders. If Bernie Sanders had a chance, I would vote for Bernie Sanders. If Elizabeth Warren had a chance, I would vote for Elizabeth Warren. I would have voted for Hillary Clinton. But that's your right. That's your prerogative. It's not a judgment, beloved. Melody, I'm just saying, a vote for a third party in this particular instance is a wasted vote. I'm an independent. I would much rather vote for an independent candidate. I would much rather vote for a green candidate. I would much rather vote for an independent candidate. But in an option of more Trump or no Trump, we don't have no option. We don't have any option. You haven't heard me say a whole lot about Biden-Harris. I'm going to vote Biden-Harris, but you ain't heard me say a whole lot about Biden-Harris. I'm not jumping up and down and doing cartwheels over a Biden-Harris ticket. I am jumping up and down to prevent more of Trump. I absolutely can't do more of Trump. It will change our culture irrevocably. It will change our future irrevocably. So I get it. I understand feeling like, what do you say, the worst of two evils? I get it. I do. But I'm not going to risk my vote in the face of Trump. That's just not going to work. I understand, Life Bearer. I get it. I'm not even quite sure where you live. I would like to offer that if you are indeed African American, living, breathing, residing in America, it matters. It doesn't require or demand to be so political, but it matters. It matters. So I appreciate you all. I'm going to stop now and move forward. I have appointments to cover for today. I'm going to have me some lunch. I look forward to being back here with you again at high noon U.S. Central Standard Time for another powerful edition of Revolutionary Voodoo, New Orleans Voodoo Secrets and Recipes. All is truly and indeed a blessing if you can just see beyond the veils. Ashe.